everybody. It's now 1 p.m, so the meeting's going to start. Welcome to the Planning, Regeneration and Economic Development Decision Meeting. My name is Donna Jones and I'm the leader of the City Council and also the Cabinet Member with responsibility for PRED. A little bit of housekeeping and safety information to start with. If the continuous fire alarm does sound, it means that we do need to evacuate the building. There is no planned test. If the fire alarm does sound, then the assembly point is outside in front of the Queen Victoria statue in front of the civic offices. In order to comply with Portsmouth Cultural Trust fire marshal regulations, please remember to sign out when you leave the building. I don't think any of us have signed in, so, but if you have signed in, could you please sign out? Otherwise, please just leave the building quickly. We are live web streaming the meeting today. So this will obviously be shared on the Council's website and other social media pages. This is the second decision meeting, I think, that we have web streamed. So the camera is up there in the corner of the room. So for anybody making a deputation, it's likely the back of your head will be shown. If anybody has any issue, please could you let me know before you start making your deputation, and alternative arrangements can be made. Members of the public are also permitted to record the meeting in their own right if they wish as well. Okay, so moving on to the agenda for us today, we do have deputations. We've got 4 councillors who have put down to deputise. That's Councillor Tom Wood, Councillor Susie Horton, Councillor Steve Pitt and Councillor Lee Hunt. And I understand, did have apologies from Councillor Dowling, but you are here, which we're delighted with. So, well, good. So first of all, colleagues, any declarations of interest? No? Okay, I have none either. Vicky, any other apologies for absence? No. No. Okay, thank you very much. Right, so item 3 on the agenda, which is the Houses and Multiple Occupation SPD, so the revision to the SPD. I'm going to hand over to Claire Upton-Brown, Assistant Director of City Regeneration and Planning, who will introduce the report.
Good afternoon. Members, this report is coming to you to report back on the consultation on the suggested amendments to the HMO SPD. It's a detailed report that sets out the responses with specific details on the responses from the Portsmouth and District Property Landlord Association, the East St Thomas Forum and the University of Portsmouth responses. I've detailed in the report why some of the suggested amendments cannot be taken forward in the context of a planning SPD. However, my recommendation is that there are some minor amendments in paragraph 1.17, 1.22 and 1.24 to cover the details on plans to include bathroom, sanitary ware and kitchen fitments with white goods at paragraph 1.17, to reference sui generis use at paragraph 1.22, and to further break down the definitions within paragraph 1.24. I would like this afternoon to further amend my recommendation to recommend that the amenity table at page 8 is further amended so that all references for 3 to 5 persons are changed to 3 to 6, and reference of 6 or more is changed to 7 or more, and that the amenity combined living standard for 7 plus is reduced from 34 square metres to 27 square metres to be consistent with the requirement under private sector housing, and also the definition under notes at 1, which is defining the communal living space or combined living space, is further expanded to include utility rooms, shared space for storage, washing machines, etc. I'd seek within the delegation to actually confirm those words in consultation with the leader with responsibility for planning, regeneration and economic development. Further amendment at 3 is that there is a further consultation around the issue that has been brought up by the Residents' Forum concerning sandwiching which is a situation where you have a HMO, a dwelling, and then the outside property applies to be an HMO, so that we don't end up in a situation where you have a dwelling between two HMOs, and for situations where we receive an application where the third property in a row would be an HMO. So I'm seeking authority this afternoon to do a further consultation on that additional suggested amendment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire. So we have 3 members of the public who have requested to make a deputation today: Martin Willoughby, Trevor Wilcox and Tony Athill. And I wonder if the 3 gentlemen could come forward, please, and take a seat in front of a microphone. When it's your time to speak, you just press the yellow button, and that will then amplify and record you, because these meetings are obviously available for people that can't make them in terms of a recording as well. You each have 6 minutes to speak. So what I will do is indicate when you have 1 minute left by just putting my hand up so that you know that it's time to wind up. And we'll start with Martin Willoughby.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to thank the Cabinet Member for Pred for the opportunity to speak this afternoon, representing the 120 members or so of the East St Thomas Residents Forum. On behalf of our members, we warmly welcome the proposal to update SPD 20 to close the loopholes which were never the intent or in the spirit of the original guidance. I want to acknowledge the support of all the councillors that sit on the planning meeting for their support of this update. I would also like to offer a specific thank you to our councillor Tom Wood, who's been hugely supportive in our endeavours. It's clear, to be clear, East St Thomas is not anti-HMO. HMO represent an important housing option for many people, including students and young professionals. I personally lived in HMOs in Cardiff and Exeter for over 7 years and fully support the fact that high-quality HMOs are an essential part of the housing mix. Our argument is simply that you cannot keep developing them all in the same place without destabilising the community in which they are located. I'm sure that from a commercial perspective, developing a large HMO in, say, Hudson Road will make sound business sense. The properties are relatively inexpensive. Students, in particular, find the area very attractive because of its close proximity to the university, therefore delivering higher and more guaranteed rents. Under the current SPD, the houses can be converted from approximately 3 bedrooms to 9 bedrooms, exploiting the loopholes and allowing for profit maximisation. The problem is that 70% of all the properties in Hudson Road are already HMOs. In fact, all of the roads on the ladder exceed the 10% threshold beyond which the community is considered unsustainable and imbalanced. The closure of this loophole to prevent the development of intensive super HMOs should at least halt further imbalancing of our community and is welcomed. On sandwiching and 3 in a row, we welcome the proposal to restrict on sandwiching and 3 in a row developments. These principles are almost ubiquitous in planning guidance of major councils in England, including Southampton, Bath, Warwick, Brighton, to name but a few. These councils see these measures as important tools to promote balanced and sustainable communities, and we firmly believe that Portsmouth should have a single professional-grade toolbox to shape the future of housing in the city. Rebalancing. East St Thomas has suffered massively from the lack of planning control prior to 2011. We made some suggestions to help rebalancing as part of the consultation, but these were unfortunately rejected. We would therefore, however, ask the Council to support, in whatever way it can, policies which help nudge the housing mix back towards a community which is more balanced and sustainable. And finally, transparency. At the last Pred meeting, the Councillor talked about how she wanted to be able to sit at home at her computer and look up the licensing details for any HMO in the city. Exactly what she could do if she was a Brighton resident. We fully support the leader in this request and would like to see this implemented as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Wilcox.
Thank you. I contend that the implementation of the amendments to the Houses of Multiple Occupation SPD, as they stand, will impact on the ability of the private rental sector to satisfy the needs of young professionals looking to live in high-quality shared accommodation close to their place of work in Portsmouth. My current concerns are One, the application of stringent room sizes without considering how the whole property services the needs of such young professionals. Secondly, although that it seems to be slightly amended, the requirement for a combined living space of 34 square metres ignores how these houses are used or the availability of the housing stock with such spaces. And thirdly, the proposed implementation timescale will move the goalposts for many developments already underway. To consider how the property services the needs of the tenant, the SPD document needs to look at how the whole house services the tenants. So some sort of trade-off is going to need to be made between the sizes of individual rooms, en-suites, shared bathrooms, storage areas, utility rooms, kitchen, dining and living space. And en-suite seems to be the preferred options at the moment. But would a young professional prefer to have a 10-metre square room or a 7.5 square metre room with a slightly smaller than provisioned en-suite at 2.5 square metres? Communal facilities are often supplied in utility rooms, secure storage, shared toilets, etc., as well as the main kitchen, diner, lounge arrangements. Do young professionals prefer dedicated utility rooms to do their washing and drying, or do they want it all in the kitchen where they're trying to eat their food? The SB needs to be able to ensure that, on balance, the standard and size of facilities provided is sufficient, and that perfectly good potential HMOs are not turned down or the facilities they provide impaired because their configuration does not fit a rigid standard. The new requirement for 34 square metres for HMOs of 7 or more takes no account of how young professionals use these buildings. Apart from the trade-offs I've already mentioned, I'd argue that the provision of good standard environments and sufficient space within bedrooms is more important in shared houses where the only private and secure facilities to store occupiers' possessions or obtain privacy are within their private bedrooms. A shared household of 7 does need to have space to cook, eat and socialise, but they will not require space for everyone to sit and eat or even watch television in the same space at the same time. Not many family units of 7 do this anymore. And finally, there's also less housing stock in Portsmouth that could be converted to provide 34 square metres space without the provision of extremely large extensions, impacting neighbours and reducing the availability of outside space likely to be used during the summer months. This requirement is unnecessary and will reduce provision. Finally, turning 3-bedroom, 2-reception room houses into HMOs capable of housing more than 6 people in comfort can take 6 to 12 months from initial C4 planning through to the final conversion and provision of an HMO licence for 7 or more. These developments are normally, I can talk about myself only really, undertaken after considerable consultation with the relevant housing and planning officers. A suitable implementation timeframe and process is required to ensure that these developments underway are not left hanging. Not to do so will leave properties in limbo, not suitable for family use and not allowable for HMO use, despite possibly being of superior provision to much of the HMO stock in the city. To address these concerns, I would suggest the following changes to the proposed amendments. Firstly, where bedrooms are greater than the size than the NDSS standards, a proportion of the additional space, maybe 50%, should count towards communal space on the assumption that tenants will have additional storage and socialising space in their room. The combined living space should be reduced from 34. There is an argument that 27 is too much. 24, 25 is more reasonable and is what tends to happen at the moment. When counting communal areas, all communal areas, apart from hall, stairs and landings, should be counted. Shared bathrooms, utility rooms, box rooms, dry storage, cupboards, etc. And then finally, the implementation should be staged to allow current developments to be finished and licensed. I would suggest that they should be applied in full at least 6 months after the amendments are adopted. Until then, current standards should continue to be used. In conclusion, we're all aware of the negative connotations that can be associated with HMOs, especially when they are done badly or come to dominate an area. So I applaud the Council's attempts to ensure that the accommodation supplied is fit for purpose and that the quality of life for the residents and the neighbouring community is not negatively impacted. However, many parts of Portsmouth are not dominated by HMOs, and the continuing application of Article 4 will ensure they stay that way. Similarly, there are some HMOs where accommodation is cramped and overcrowded. However, not all landlords want to cram them in with no consideration of comfort. The Council should encourage landlords in the private rental sector who can show that they are supplying quality accommodation for people who want to live, work and spend in the community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was excellent. 5 seconds to spare. That was almost on the money. Brilliant. Thank you very much. And finally, last but absolutely not least, Tony.
Thank you. My name is Tony Attill. I'm a representative of Portsmouth and District Private Landlords Association. I don't personally have any HMOs, like I suspect my colleague might next to me, but I'm a long-standing advocate of the need for more and believe this would... Sorry, I pressed my button. And believe this would ease the housing crisis. I also understand the problems caused by some occupants of shared housing and the pressure on non-HMO residents put on the council to restrict numbers. I'd like to thank the previous speaker. Would you like a job? I've been rather lax in my job, and I am very aware that I have not covered in my presentation a lot of of what has been said by the previous speaker, but we would endorse pretty well all of it. You'll see what I would disagree with in a mo. Try to concentrate on some of the points of disagreement with the report, though I do note that there is a fair bit that we did agree with. Many landlords are already upgrading their properties, leaving small rooms empty and giving plenty of communal space. Rents are going up at twice the rate for other rental sectors. But where are all the poor single people going? If you continue to discourage new HMO creation, those at the bottom of the housing ladder will be hit hardest. A little bit of an update to my presentation. While walking from the car park, I had a chat with a couple of policemen. I said, how much has street homeless increased since this time last year? They said it's doubled. Without any prompting, they said, you know what they did in Waverley Road? Yeah, I know very well what they did on the Waverley Road. I'm in Bruce Lomax's HMO consultation and governance board. And he said, well, if you walk down Commercial Road right now, you will find a number of people who were former occupants of Waverley Road. So I beg the leader, I beg councillors to be mindful of the implications of anything you do to HMOs in this city. I know Waverley Road's needed something done to it, but encourage good HMOs, and you free up one-bedroom flats, etc. up the ladder. When the homelessness reduction bill starts having impact next year, you'll be forced to help more single homeless people. Where are you going to put them? I know of landlords selling HMOs, mainly a result of government tax changes, etc. Many will go back to private homes. These rooms will need replacing if demands are not met, if demands are to be met. You are making this work more challenging for us and our landlords. Good landlords will invest outside the city, where the restrictions do not exist. There is a tendency to see demand for shared housing as being primarily from students, and more halls are being provided for them. If they can afford the high rents. There is also growing demand from young working professionals no longer able to buy from the transient or from transient workers on contracts in the docks, hospitals, etc. Contract labour being very popular these days in these uncertain times. We are struggling to meet this demand with potential impact on the local economy. If I had a standard C3 house in, say, North End, and it became vacant, and I had an inquiry from 3 contract workers working on the new carriers, there are a lot of them about, we've had inquiries, Are they going to wait 8 weeks while I get planning permission for change of use? Even if I did get it, under these proposals, it would be rejected because one room's under 7.5 square metres. By restricting what landlords and developers can do, you are further reducing the incentives they have to make major refurbishments in rundown property. As the university has pointed out, it is not a function of the planning system to lay down safety and comfort standards for accommodation. The SBD attempts to duplicate the function of housing standards and the Housing Acts by creating a new set of rules. Planning should not be asking for detailed plans of room specifications. This places a totally unnecessary burden on the applicant. Understanding HMO regulations is complicated enough without adding yet another set of criteria. What I find outrageous about these proposals is the insistence that the new HMO bedrooms must be over 7.5 metres floor area. Some of the other space requirements are also worrying, and my colleague has covered most of that more thoroughly. Even the university is wrong in its submission, suggesting that 6.5 square metres is a statutory minimum. The 7.5 metre figure appears to be derived from the NDSS specification for new builds, not for the change of use for existing buildings. This is very serious, as we did a survey in Portsmouth, and many houses with one room under 6.5 square metres. God knows how many houses have rooms that are perfectly usable under 7.5 square metres. In an appeal...
Much for making your deputations, gentlemen. If you'd like to take a seat back in the public gallery, because we have 4 other deputies that wish to come and make a deputation. Thank you. Councillors Wood, Horton, Pitt and Hunt. Do you have any preference of the order you'd like to do your deputations in? Okay, well, I've got them on the list here then as Tom Wood first, then Susie Horton, then Steve Pitt, then Councillor Lee Hunt. Is that okay? Right, super. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak today, and thank you for approaching this issue in such a positive and cross-party way over the last year, and for taking so many meetings with me about it. You must have got very bored of me going on about it, and I'm extremely grateful. The proposed SPD does lots of good things, but I'm going to particularly focus on closing the loophole for sui generis HMOs, or super HMOs, for those who don't like more Latin phrases than are absolutely necessary. The current SPD introduced in 2012 has worked reasonably well. It's prevented any further high concentrations of HMO in the city and has preserved any existing mixed and balanced community. There were, however, 2 flaws with the previous SPD. First, that it wasn't able to do anything to support communities that had already become imbalanced, those that were already well over the 10% limit that it introduced. And second, that like all regulations, given enough time, people will eventually find a loophole in it. The loophole that they found in the current SPD was that in an area with more than 10% HMO, although you can't turn a family home into a new HMO, you could turn an HMO into a super HMO. Now, this has a certain logic if you just live in a world of planning classifications, because it technically doesn't increase the number of HMOs in the area. But from the residents that I've spoken to on the doorstep, the idea that you can take a 3-bed HMO, say, gut the interior, put in an extra floor and turn it into a 9-bedroom super HMO, and that counts as basically the same thing because it's still an HMO, in an area where you wouldn't be allowed to put in a new HMO in the first place, seems kind of ridiculous. Martin touched earlier how the St Thomas Residents Forum and I also have been really clear that our problem with HMOs is not about students. They're often seen as student houses, though that's not strictly always true. And in fact, our problem isn't with students, and it's not actually with landlords, and it's not really either with HMOs or super HMOs. Our problem is with the saturation of super HMOs. Any of the problems that some HMOs might cause, in moderation, are just part of living in a city where you don't get to choose who your neighbours are, and a little bit of friendly contact gets you along fairly well. Saturation is what causes some of the problems that I'd like to quickly touch on. Firstly, rubbish. Contrary to the stereotype, people who live in HMOs are not messier than anyone else. But quite logically, if you more than double the number of people in the property, they're going to produce more than double the amount of rubbish. That's probably going to be in a building that doesn't have enough space to store it. Certainly on the ladder you have properties either with no forecourt or with a tiny one, and on bin day they fill the pavement outside their home with rubbish bags because that's how much rubbish that many people generate. And quite naturally, when you first move into a new home, sometimes you get bin day wrong. HMOs have a very high turnover with lots of people moving in the same week. You only need 1 or 2 of them to get bin day wrong, and they will. And suddenly you have a street filled with rubbish bags getting ripped open by foxes, and you have trash all over the street for a week. The reverse happens on moving out. It's impossible to move 9 people out of a home without generating mess. That's what moving out does. When 70% of a street moves out all in the same week, there's a huge amount of mess. If they don't move out on bin day, there's a huge amount of mess for up to a week. And it's not because they're messier, that's because that's what having 70% of high concentration housing does. There's a lack of community created by HMOs. HMOs might well be empty for a long period over the summer. Last year I spoke to one old lady on the doorstep who told me that over the summer months, for a long period, she has no neighbours for any house on either side. She hasn't got a problem with people living there. She's got a problem with people not living there. She feels isolated and unsafe in her own home because she effectively lives on an empty street for a quarter of the year. It's also difficult to build up stronger community relations when your neighbours turn over every year. It gets hard to get a real community feel. And lastly, noise. Obviously, 9 people make more than twice as much noise as 4 people. But again, the problem is the high turnover that HMOs tend to have. Over the last few months, I've been regularly going around the ladder in East St Thomas and calling on homes where people have had noisy parties and so their neighbours have complained to me. Almost without exception, when I knock on the door and say, you really kept your neighbours awake till 3 in the morning, they are incredibly sheepish and incredibly apologetic. And they promise never to do it again. And as a rule, anyone I've spoken to has never made any noise again. But if 70% of your road is an HMO with 9 people in it, you only need 1 or 2 of those people to have one party once and then learn the error of their ways, and you're not getting any sleep for the first term of the year. So the problem is not with the individual HMOs, the problem is with the saturation. I've been sitting through several planning committees where I've seen members on all parties desperately trying to support the principles of mixed and balanced communities, but they're not able to do it with the current regulations. And I have a wonderful analogy that I found, the heap of sand paradox. I don't know if you're familiar with it. We don't have enough philosophical paradoxes in planning meetings, I feel. But the argument is that if you take a single grain of sand, that's not a heap of sand. And if you add 1 grain of sand to something, that doesn't make it a heap. And you can keep applying that endlessly until you've got more sand than you can fill a beach with, but you've never turned it into a heap. And that's exactly how planning works at planning committee. Because we're forced to consider each application individually, then you can have 4 HMOs on the same road in the same meeting, which we have done, and we have to pretend that they're not making a heap of sand. The only way we can tackle this problem is by changing the policy, and that's what this new SPD does. And since I'm running out of time, so thank you to Claire for all her hard work on it, and I think it's excellent.
Thank you very much. The sands of time were literally running away with me. Thank you very much for your really informed deputation. Councillor Horton.
Thank you again for the opportunity to talk, and to Claire for the report. And I know that a lot of us have been working on this issue for a long time in a really considered and measured way, so thank you for that. And it is an issue I deal with on a daily basis in one way or another. First of all, I'm a councillor in Central Southsea Ward, which probably, I don't think St Thomas and Central need to compete as such, but we're definitely in the same boat on this one. There is not a day that goes by without some resident contacting us with an issue to do with, broadly speaking, to do with this issue. I'm also a resident in my own ward in a road which has far in excess of 10% HMOs, and can see, so therefore I live through the issues that people are raising. Incidentally, I'm also a landlord, not in the city, I hasten to add, but I am a landlord, so I actually do understand some of the issues that have been raised by the landlords. And like a lot of people in this room, I've been a previous tenant in shared accommodation. I also work at the university, so I have day-to-day contact with students as human beings rather than some kind of homogenous group to demonise, and definitely agree with the previous speakers that this is not an anti-student thing. So I've also been on the planning committee and have taken case by case. So I realise that all that build-up is to basically say that I understand the complexities of this, and it's not a straightforward change of words and everything will be okay. And I think the report is really good, and I actually had sympathies with both sides of the argument, and I could understand where people were coming from. So given the fact that it's not a straightforward issue, I'm not actually going to focus on a lot of the detail, and some of the stuff I actually was going to speak on has been covered by other people, so I'll try and skip over that. But I think, and I think we do this in planning generally, but I think in particular here, I always try and use the principle of what's good for me or my family or my friends when I'm looking at these issues and considering these points of views. And I just want to, rather than delve into the detail, because I think the report covers a lot of the detail in the previous deputations, but I just want to focus on a couple of the principles of it. And actually, and I know Tom's just covered this a bit, but some of the stuff that in the report says this is beyond the remit of planning, we can't ignore, because we know that if we change planning, that we will be influencing these things, and I don't think we would be being very fair if we ignored them. So the first thing is about the commitment to creating a mixed and balanced community, and people have a different view of that. On a personal level, when I was a student in Lancaster, I lived in the Lancaster, in a property owned by the Lancaster Muslim Welfare Society, and I lived in a street which had so many different people living it. And actually, as students, there were a lot of student houses, but it was a really good learning experience. So I'm absolutely for the kind of mixed and balanced community. And on a local issue here, probably one of my most fun days was that when it snowed really badly a few years ago, and all the students were out playing snowballs with everyone else in the street down here in Southsea. So it's definitely not a student issue. I was going to go on to say a lot of what Tom said, so I'll skip over it. But basically, I actually believe that most of the shared houses that cause problems are not actually then it's not the majority, and some of it's about education, particularly around the rubbish and things. But the saturation point is a really valid one, because normalisation is different when you have a road with 90% HMOs in it compared with when you have a more realistic less than 10%. So Tom used the example of the parties, and I've done exactly the same thing as him, knocking on a door and just saying to people, you have chosen to live in a residential area, and please can you be a bit more considerate. And 9 times out of 10, it's sorted. But I just think what happens is that if everyone else is doing this, then we will do this. Same with bins, etc., etc. The other principle, I think, is the commitment to provide high-quality accommodation for all. And this is not just students, and it's not just young professionals. It can be older professionals or even old non-professionals. Some people don't have a house to themselves nowadays, and actually I think we need to be considering the needs of all these people. So I welcome the detail of the room sizes and the communal areas, and particularly the stuff around bathroomware and white goods. As we know in planning, we actually try and imagine what it would be like living in this particular house with the floor plans in front of us with 11 people. And actually, reflecting on it, it's made me quite angry when I think of some of the first accommodation I lived in London. There was 3 of us in a tiny flat with a washing machine in someone's bedroom in a corner. And I look back and I think I wish someone had been actually out to protect me from that, because I felt I didn't have any choice. So like many issues we're all aware, it's extremely complex, but I do think we have a responsibility. Okay, that's about right. So to predict all the eventualities that come out of this change in the SPD. And you can never predict everything, but I think if we don't try and run through the video, as it were, of what could this mean for this landlord, what could this mean for this person sandwiched between 2 HMOs, etc., I think we wouldn't be doing our job properly, which is why we're having such a good and robust debate about it. So basically, in summary, I'm supporting the amendment. I'm really glad that there's going to be consultation about the sandwiching, because that's the one for me where I can see kind of both perspectives, and I really sort of I'm interested in to see what sort of potential scenarios come out about that. So, and I'm also particularly pleased to see if this is adopted, it will have immediate effect. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your comments. Councillor Steve Pitt.
Thank you, Leader. First off, thanking Claire and her team and yourself for all the work that's gone into this. We know it's been a huge amount and it is very much appreciated. I wanted to make a few sort of bullet point comments about some of the other things that have been raised. One of the things that doesn't necessarily come across the radar very often because it's not part of planning is permitted development. And a lot of the HMOs, especially the super HMOs that are being created, as Tom likes to call them quite effectively, and even some of the smaller ones, and we're seeing it in our ward, is that permitted development allows people to unreasonably, in terms of the urban landscape, make those changes to those buildings that they would otherwise maybe not be making. So in one particular road, we have a resident who I visited recently, who, because there's a lot of HMOs around her that have been being extended, she's been living in a building site for 18 months. It's not a joke, it's very serious. And when you walk down some of our roads, the rhythm of the street scene is ruined by massive sudden dormer extensions. Now, permitted development is permitted development, and we can't do anything about that. What we can do is in some way limit it with this SPD, because it will discourage some of these large HMOs being developed before any application is made to private sector housing or planning. They come in retrospectively after the work's been done, and then we're delivered with a fait accompli. So any kind of restrictions we can put around that, and that is partly to do with room sizes. It wouldn't be retrospective. There's a lot of HMO stock in the south of the city already, and where those rooms do not meet those sizes, we're not going to take them back to planning and remove their planning permissions. But we're seeing applications come to planning committee where we're questioning whether it's possible for somebody to even stand up in most of the room that's been created in a loft space to add an additional room. There was one at the last planning committee where the average head height in the room was 1.5 metres. Now, I'm not very tall, but I am taller than 1.5 metres, and most people are. So by tightening it up, it does allow us to have a bit more control, and it also provides transparency in the process, because it's the residents that come to the planning committee to ask the planning committee to make rational decisions that they can understand. That's the public forum where they are. And if we don't align the two systems around room sizes and that all happens somewhere else, we can have incidents in planning where someone comes in and it looks like 3 people will live in that HMO. They then disappear off, change all of the plans for the building, and it becomes a 6-person HMO. And the residents have then got no recourse on that at all, and they've not had the opportunity to look at what's actually proposed next to their house, and I don't think that that's reasonable. If we've got the opportunity to amend it so that there's transparency and people can actually see what's going on, I think that's really important. The other thing is that I don't think anybody's suggesting that the planning committee, and I know certainly not in my case, if the living space is 0.5 metres under the minimum requirement and the bedrooms are all bigger than 7.5, the planning committee has the ability to be flexible. No, none of us sit there saying, yes, we absolutely have to comply with every single tiny bit of detail, but it gives us a baseline to work to. So if we can see that living space is being removed and pushing people into small bedrooms, we have the ability to have some leverage on that, and currently we don't. And so I do think that's really important. All of us want to see high quality HMOs in this city, for students, for working professionals, for whoever's going to live in them. What we don't want is cram them in mentality, where to make some extra money out of a property and existing living space is being removed just to create extra income. That is not about providing mixed and balanced communities. It's not about looking after plenty of room for single people to live in. That's just about making money. There are plenty of houses that we're seeing coming up, especially in the north of the city, where those minimum room standards are very adequate for those properties because they tend to be larger than the ones in the south. What we're trying to do, hopefully, with this is to stop the same problems occurring up there with unnecessary subdivisions of rooms that could impact on the living standards of those communities in that part of the city. They're being very animated about it, and making sure that they understand that we are considering that, I think, is important. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly was sandwiching. It is something I actually raised with Claire a while back when we were having one of the various meetings that's gone on this, and at that point it wasn't on the radar. I welcome it. My only concern is that we are very clear that retrospectively, where we are over the 10% and then sandwiching applies to those properties, that they can't then use any kind of loophole in this to have their property turned into an HMO, because in parts of St Thomas and in central Southsea we already have a large number of sandwich properties. We need to be, we need to be very clear that this will apply from now on, because otherwise all we'll end up doing is increasing the number of HMOs in already saturated communities. So that was a slight concern. The final plea is, please can we revisit the planning HMO register and the private sector housing HMO register to try and get them more aligned. If we can put down the number of residents that's supposed to be living in that property, that's agreed, and have all of that in a public place, as Brighton have done, it does create transparency. I know that the private sector landlords have issues about that, but we could work with them on it to make sure that we address those issues. But having transparency in the process, at the moment, if you have an HMO with a 50-metre radius and it crosses 2 roads, if you can't go to the civic offices, it costs you £400 to get that information sent to you digitally. Bruce is quite happy for people to go in, but if you actually want it sent to you, there's rules that apply, and it makes it onerous for the residents. We need to be clear that everyone has a right to know what's happening and make sure it works effectively. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you very much, Councillor Pitt. Some interesting points made there, which I shall come back to afterwards. Councillor Lee Hunt.
Yeah, thank you. So I just want to pick up on points that people have made around. First of all, I prefer to see the minimum standards rise rather than drop, and I think that that is an important point for the north of the city and the houses up there in particular. And on sandwiching, that is a really good point. I think you've accepted that rose from Steve Pitt. We can't do something that retrospectively allows people to then sell the home and create 3 in a row. That did concern me when I saw the report. Having been with these matters for many years, I very much hope that you will, on behalf of thousands of local people, including residents living in shared housing, agree the recommendations. I'd like to thank Claire Upton-Brown and her team and all those who have helped with this report, which I welcome. Since I'm thanking lots of people, I'd also like to thank my ward colleague Steve Pitt, who first raised the issue of sandwiching and 3 in a row, and he's done it again today, and I very much trust that you approve the 6-week consultation on that recommendation, which will lead to even more mixed and more balanced communities. So this is a very helpful report. Councillor Jones and officers, I can assure the Portsmouth District Landlords Association and other landlord representations there are plenty of applications coming forward for more HMOs and more bedrooms in more HMOs becoming available to rent. And we see that every month at the Planning Committee. What is very clear, though, is that there is a continuing demand now for higher standards and scrutiny by members of the Planning Committee, and standards are going up. But not always, Councillor Jones. It saddens me to see communal areas in HMOs stripped out and to make way for another bedroom, cramming yet more people in for financial gain. I, for one, very much understand that to invest into better and higher standards in future and in existing shared housing, that a profit needs to be made, but not at the cost of living standards. And I think this report reflects that. I very much hope that the Portsmouth District Landlords Association will see over the upcoming years just how much the decisions that you'll take today and those that this council have made before around the 10% SPD guidance has and is improving its own industry. You only have to see the applications coming to the Planning Committee nowadays to see how much standards have been driven up. We have seen some terribly grim things in the past, and that's becoming less and less now. And going back to the thanks, so I have to thank East St Thomas Residents Association and indeed Tom, who when I was, truthfully, at the earlier part of this, I felt rather assailed, sticking up and rejecting applications and trying to convince the committee to reject applications for very good reasons. And they came along, and their tenacity is one of the reasons that we're here today. They've done a very good job indeed. and it shows how local people in Portsmouth can come and make representations that affect policy. Councillor Jones, pre-2011, I went to then Councillor Hancock with this issue. We both saw how the issue around HMOs needed to be more fair. Whole streets were headed that way. Residents were selling up and moving away. I attended public meetings where residents vented fury, real fury, at the erosion of their neighbourhoods as one house fell after the other. So I could talk about the history of the 10%. I think you know it very well. It was rejected street by street, which was the position of the council first, and then we had the 50 metres radius. Effectively, it's the same thing in my view. Other councillors and people have talked about the impact of bad shared housing and indeed all sorts of housing on street visual amenities with ridiculous structures added on, sometimes one on top of the other, subdivision of existing bedrooms and getting rid of communal rooms. And that's something that this policy will help redress again and will help us on the planning committee. The 10% policy works, it will continue to work, and these amendments that I hope that you're going to implement today will also help us on the planning committee. And for anybody who's listening, that's my paper turning over. It's not me having a fit. And today we've got these papers in front of us, these amendments, and with the help of the industry and the help of everybody, thank you, I'm going to shut up very soon, we will help neighbours, we will help neighbourhoods, we will support mixed and balanced communities, and for me, the one thing that matters a great deal is the people who live in them. For too long they were disregarded, they were just milked for their rent, and the landlords just walked away. Not all landlords, I will say, but a lot of landlords did. They were seen as a cash cow that kept on having to be milked. And this council, the planning committee, Portsmouth Housing Standards, have turned that around. We're now on the side of everybody, and I hope very much that you will support the report. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much for making your deputations today. I'd like to start as well by saying thank you to a number of people, because throughout the consultation period, Claire has been feeding back to me with members of the development control team and the planning policy team all of the comments that have been coming in. And I'm very aware, Mr Willoughby, of the extensive work that the East St Thomas Neighbourhood Forum have carried out and how useful that has been to us in, you know, it can be very, very difficult when you consult when all you get is negativity and no positive suggestions. And actually what I'm very aware of is some very practical and very sensible propositions that have been made by that particular neighbourhood group, and I think it's very, very commendable on your part. Whilst we're talking about St Thomas, it would be remiss of me not to mention, I feel, my wingman, really, which is Councillor Tom Wood, because you're right, you have spent a huge amount of time working on this issue. You have made yourself available, you have gone out of your way to come and speak to me about this, and actually, where I live and the ward that I represent, I don't get a lot of casework about this, and if it wasn't for people like yourselves coming forward and making me aware of just what an impact it's having on certain communities, I honestly wouldn't have known quite to the extent. So thank you very much for what you've done and for fighting the cause so admirably over the last 8-9 months to make sure, well, I mean, it's been longer than that, but particularly over the last 8-9 months since we've been giving consideration of that Article 4 direction. So thank you very much. The Portsmouth District Landlords Association, I'll be coming to your Christmas drinks, so we'll be able to talk about this a bit further. So thank you for inviting me to that a couple of days ago. But actually, again, I appreciate that you're sort of also sticking up for the point that Councillor Horton made, which is actually there's two sides to this, and there really are. And I think, you know, as any member of the City Council, whether it's through full council, whether it's, you know, me sitting here now, my predecessor, or whoever may come, you know, after me, doing this particular role and setting policy that directs planning in this city, or particularly development control policy. What are we trying to achieve? We are trying to achieve mixed and balanced communities so that the residents that we serve can have happy and fulfilled lives, if you're taking it at a purist view. And actually, we need HMOs, because if we didn't have HMOs, we would have such substantial overcrowding. Well, it it would be horrendous. So we do need them, but what we need are good quality HMOs that give people good quality of life. And also, I think the point that has been made by all of the councillors and also by some of the private individuals who are here as made deputations as well, is around the fact that, you know, good quality HMOs actually can really add to the local economy, whether it be students or working professionals. And in actual fact, I was just thinking about this as the deputations were being made. I think I've lived in 3 HMOs in Southsea before I bought my first home, so over 20 years ago, in Taswell Road, Jubilee Terrace and St Ronan's Road. So all big houses, expensive for one person or, you know, one family to own and live in on their own. And there were 5 of us, 5 shared professional people. Yes, I'm sure our neighbours probably didn't like the fact around the cars that we brought, but actually in terms of our bins and everything else, I think we were really good neighbours. We invited people in for drinks at Christmas and we tried to do all the community things. So actually living next door to working professional people is not always a bad thing. And as public transport improves in the city and more cycleways, hopefully there'll be less cars in those professional HMOs, because there'll be an alternative for professionals to choose to get around as well. To Claire and the team, it's been a journey, hasn't it? There's been a huge amount that's been going on. You've obviously kept me up to date on everything, so thank you very much. If you could take those comments back. Just going on to some of the specific comments before I move on to my colleagues. Mr Willoughby, you mentioned about the register of the HMO database. I mean, you know, like I said the last time we discussed this before we kick-started the consultation, for me, members of the public who are interested and who are prepared to help us, such as yourselves, are our eyes and ears out there in the community. And we will not have an accurate reflection of where the HMOs are in the city unless we have an HMO database that is publicly available, that can be cross-referenced and checked. And that's both 3C and C4. So Claire, it would be great if you can give us an update on how far away we are from publishing through our website what HMO database we currently have. We know it needs work. We know we need to put, you know, there'll be some data missing, or possibly some houses that were HMOs that possibly no longer are. In terms of when that is ready and it is publicly available, so that everyone is aware that it's then available, we can obviously contact the obvious people, such as yourselves, because you've made deputations, but we'll also make sure we put out a press release so that it gets covered online and in the local media, so that hopefully reaches those that are interested in this. In terms of the point that Trevor made around the implementation time of, you know, it can take up to 12 months, that's a crying shame when we've got housing need in the city. So we will look to see whether that can be expedited as much as possible, and I will take that away and work on that with Claire. So thank you very much for raising that one in particular. In terms of the mention of Waverley Road, well, that was an interesting choice, Tony, I have to say, because, you know, Waverley Road, for the private residents that are living there in their private homes, some of them have had their homes devalued hugely because of a mismanagement of HMOs in that area. But, like I said, we do need HMOs, so I think Waverley Road is a classic example of where things go wrong when you have irresponsible landlords. Because where you have responsible landlords, you do not get the kind of mix of people living together like we've had in Waverley Road. And actually, whilst this is going to sound slightly pedantic or extreme, it ends up with people dying. And actually, in Waverley Road, it did. Somebody was murdered because an HMO wasn't being managed properly. And so the police actually came to us to intervene around that specifically, to use our statutory powers. And I'm very pleased that we did. And if I could go back and do it again, I would. And in fact, I'd do it sooner and try and prevent the death of that poor person who, for various reasons, ended up losing their lives. In terms of the points that were made around the C3 by Councillor Tom Wood, the C3, C4 automatic conversion, the combined effect, the saturation, yeah, absolutely. And in some communities, it's got to a point where I sit here and scratch my head and think, well, how can we unpick that? How can we undo that? And it's very, very difficult because obviously we can't impose certain things retrospectively where they are already there. But we do have a duty of care, as you've alluded to and said, that, you know, to make sure that this doesn't continue to happen in bigger areas across the whole of the city. There was a point made by Councillor Steve Pitt around the retrospective position around sandwiching and the consultation we're about to move into. I think they were good points. it's worth us exploring the licensing option. You know, how can we address that with sandwiching? And I think that Claire and I probably need to go through the detail of the licensing consultation wording, and I would like to share that with you as members of the planning committee and also councillors who live in the relevant wards, to see if we can get that agreed, much as we did with this consultation that's just closed on the Article 4 amendments, but if we can do that on sandwiching as well, because I think it would be good to get your take on those things. Right, so that's the final comments from me. Over to colleagues. Councillor Dowling.
Thank you, Leader. I'll try to keep it brief because I know lots of people have already had their say. I've got kind of 2 comments and then a couple of questions that I would like Claire to cover, if that's okay. I thought I'd start by just saying that I think it quite often both residents and councillors alike forget that councillors are also quote-unquote real people. And quite what that means is sometimes up for much debate as someone that spends a lot of time with fellow councillors. But if we take the examples that we've heard about students, young professionals, landlords and families. Well, if you take myself as an example, I was a student, a full-time student not all that long ago. I would, broadly speaking, consider myself a young professional now, although I might be ancient going by mental age. As far as I'm aware, my mum and brother have not yet disowned me and therefore am part of a family unit. And whilst not being a private landlord myself, I am a trustee of an organisation that does run housing. So I think and certainly from a corporate point of view as well, so I do kind of get it and understand the different aspects of that. So I just thought I'd really highlight that because I think sometimes it's forgotten that we do appreciate the different angles, the points of view, and we have very complicated decisions to make at the council, and this is definitely a very good example of that, where there are lots of different points of views to consider. The one thing that I think came up in 2 of the deputations from the public is this idea that not all landlords are bad landlords, and that I want to emphasise. I think everyone in this room absolutely agrees that not all landlords are bad landlords, and I suspect the 2 gentlemen that gave deputations today are probably very good landlords. And there was this kind of concept that it's not our job as a council to kind of intervene in certain aspects of how landlords choose to operate their homes. But I think what we have to remember as a council is that we have a responsibility for all of our residents, which means that even if 95% of people are living in houses with really good management and really good landlords, we have to think about the 5% who might not be living in homes with good landlords, and what we can do as an authority to put measures in place, and in this example through planning, to make sure that everything we've done to the best of our ability in order to protect and enable a good the ability for people to live in a good way. So I think that's a really important thing. So that's all I have to say in terms of comments. Claire, a couple of the things that were mentioned were around the role of planning and to what extent planning is important versus licensing or non-council related requirements. If you could kind of just cover that off, I think that would be useful. I think I know what you're going to say, but just for everyone's benefit. In terms of the consultation of the 3 in a row, sandwiching 6-week consultation, I know you intend to start it as soon as possible, but if there are any kind of early ideas of when as soon as possible is that kind of before Christmas, after Christmas? I assume it will be before the next local election, but an indication of time would be useful. Brilliant. And also, you mentioned again, Leader, around implementation. Where does this go now, and how does this practically become kind of council policy for the benefit of the public in here? And in case it wasn't obvious, I'm supportive of the SPD.
So on the 2 questions, sort of the importance of planning, as a city, we clearly considered having control over SPDs, HMOs, was important, and hence the reason for the Article 4 direction that we put in place. As a planning authority, we're not able to reverse what's happened historically, and I think that's what's giving all of us a significant challenge, because we've heard from people again today about communities that are not balanced because of the high concentrations of HMOs, and unfortunately, however long and hard we all thought about this SPD, we can't actually legally change that situation. So sort of the SPD and the suggested amendments goes as far as we're able within planning legislation. We are working very closely with the licensing team as well, so that we don't end up with anomalies with one team of the council saying one thing and another team saying something else. But there is some further work that we need to do collectively to make sure that we are not sending mixed messages or ending up in situations where one arm's doing one thing and the other's the other, accepting that we're working within different legislation. The leaders answered the question on the consultation. And I'm really sorry, I didn't write down your third question. Implementation, sorry, that was it. So in terms of implementation, the recommendation is that this is the SPD with the amendments is adopted, and that effectively, if the Cabinet make the decision today, that would be from effect today, which means that any applications from today onwards would be considered in light of the new SPD as the most up-to-date and current policy position, rather than the 2012 SPD.
Just for clarification, Leader, I assume that includes applications that have been submitted but not yet determined.
Yeah, legally we have to assess it on the policy at the date of determination.
Councillor Galloway.
Thank you, Leader. First of all, again, thanks to Claire and her team, but also thanks to my colleagues up there, those four, making some very salient points on this issue. I love this amendment. I think it's striding towards perfection, not quite there yet. My bête noire, of course, is parking. And I see we don't touch that. And indeed, if we can get professionals all piled into one house, I'm sure at least 2 or 3 of them must have a car, if they're professional people. Where we're putting these cars on our tiny little island is something which really worries me. It should be worrying the planning people as well, because that is a very important point which unfortunately this doesn't touch upon, and indeed maybe we can't touch upon it. Something which I think we should always consider for any planning application. I think maybe that's the next thing we should concentrate on.
Thank you very much. And I can actually add a little bit of information on that one before we move on to Councillor Chowdhury, is that it's really difficult with an article, well, with this particular Article 4 direction, because we were limited in what we can do before you trigger what's called a material change. There were certain things that came through the conversations that particularly myself and Tom had with Claire, where there were things that we wanted to do, which would have meant that we were deviating away from a minor, what's deemed in planning terms as a minor amendment, and therefore we would have had to have gone back through a public inquiry with a planning inspector to be able to adopt a significant change to the current Article 4 direction, and a transport requirement in that. Well, it wouldn't have been permitted, but it certainly would have been a major change. Now, Claire's advice to us when we were really pushing this was, if you want to do X, Y and Z, and let's say the transport requirement in an HMO to provide X number of parking spaces, depending on how many occupants, it's a C3 or a C4, would have meant that we went back to public inquiry, and Claire's opinion to us, and Claire, I'm only repeating what you said, but you can please do fill in yourself in a moment, is that we were lucky to get what we got by when Liberal Democrats did this back in 13, sorry, and actually, if we tinker with it too much, we risk undermining the entire Article 4, and we could end up with, bearing in mind the government's fairly stringent focus on additional housing, additional bedrooms at the moment across the UK, a weaker position than we're currently in. Claire, is there anything you wanted to add around that?
No, I mean, that's right. The core policy that the SPD is hanging off is PCS 20, which is a local plan policy. So we cannot deviate too far away from that policy, because we just wouldn't have a robust SPD, and that would mean that when we got to appeal, we'd lose the appeals. So we have to, this document has to be in line with PCS 20 as the current policy within the local plan.
But the overarching point you're making about parking is obviously an excellent one. I completely agree with you. And, you know, now with new homes, of course, any new home has to have 2 car parking spaces. That's right, Claire, isn't it? For a brand new dwelling, it's 2 car parking spaces. So, you know, there is something in the policy right now, actually that's probably not even that great either, because what we want to have is really excellent public transport, so we're not encouraging any more cars in Portsmouth, let alone giving houses 2 spaces. But that's another issue, and it's something that we're working on elsewhere in the council, but I get the point that you're making. Councillor Chowdhury, you arrived slightly late, so before we get started, do you have any deputations? Of course, we're talking here about houses and multiple occupation. What did I say? Sorry, I meant any interest. So whether it's through you or a family member, any sort of ownership of HMOs need to be declared now before you make your deputation.
No. Thank you very much, Leader, to asking me. And we had very good deputation today. And I'm very much happy to see the amendment for SPD. And also I had Freton, South Sea people are suffering by the noise. Because of HMO, there is maybe 5-6 people, maybe overcrowded, because a lot of people sharing, they are overcrowded. So I think I recommend to, normally we need to check every 6 months, every 3 months by the council to check the property which are under HMO. And also, I think we should very carefully, to especially South Sea and Freton, to reduce the HMO and try to go other area outside the city. Otherwise, will be whole community suffering. Because some people come to me, they said, we can't take our children to the school, we are suffering, we are mentally, physically suffering, because HMO property making noise, lots of 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning. So I said, okay, go to the police. They said, we call the police not doing nothing. So just my recommendation, we strongly reduce the HMO for the Freton and South Sea area. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's not possible to adopt it specifically for certain areas. It's a citywide HMO because we are a single planning authority. So to have it held up in planning law, of course, it has to be a policy that covers the area. And PCSO 20 actually covers houses of multiple occupation across the whole of the city. Right, Claire, anything else you'd like to add before we move to the point of decision? No? Okay. So before us today then we have 3 recommendations. One is that the SPD that went out for consultation with the amendments that have come back, the proposed SPD, so that is the this one here, PCS 20 is amended with the points in the report so that the Houses and Multiple Occupation 2017 be approved for adoption from immediate effect, including the minor amendments as worded and including the points that Claire has made today in amendment to her recommendation to us, which is that the revised policy on page 8 of the report around the combined living space of 3 to 5 people becomes 3 to 6 with the 24 metres squared for the living space, and the combined living becomes 7 or more, which was previously 6 to 10, becomes 7 or more and reduces from 34 metres squared to 27 metres squared. The reason that I'm minded to approve that is because it's in line with private sector housing standards that Bruce and team are private sector housing management. That is the current national regulation around minimum housing standards adopted by the UK government as the legislators. So all we're doing there is putting that in line with what you can do through housing standards. And that the living space is also amended to include the utilities in the footnote as made, the point that was made today by Trevor Wilcox. So thank you for that one. That makes complete sense. In terms of recommendation 2, that the Assistant City Development Director be authorised to make editorial amendments to the wording of the SPD prior to publication in consultation with me, and that these amendments shall be restricted to correcting errors and formatting text and shall not alter the meaning of the document. And of course, we will make you all aware if there are any minor amendments. And finally, the third one, that the amended SPD is adopted, but a public consultation be approved for the suggested addition to cover the issue of sandwiching, and in 3, where you have 3 houses in a row, an authority is sought to carry out a 6-week consultation starting as soon as is practically possible to add the following wording to the SPD 2017. I am happy to approve all 3 recommendations, And what I would say around the timing, I mean, ideally, I'd love to get that consultation started as soon as possible. By the time we've done the wording to the sandwiching and got that agreed, and you've all had a chance to reflect on it and feedback as well, before we push the button, we're going to be covering the Christmas period. And I think that legally it might be challengeable if we're consulting over the Christmas period. I think it would be better to start it, straight away in January, as soon as everybody comes back, and then we could look to get this implemented, hopefully at a decision meeting towards the end of February. Councillor Hunt.
It's really kind of you to take a question from me. I just wonder, around utility space, whether or not, to be helpful for the planning committee in the future, a definition of what utility space means.
Yeah,
Is
absolutely.
that all right?
We'll provide that. Yes, thank you. That's good clarification. Right, colleagues, so the agenda item 3 is agreed, and we're now moving on to agenda item 4. Thank you to everyone who came for the other agenda item. You're very welcome to stay in here on other updates on the agenda today if you wish, but I understand if you don't want to hang around. Okay, item 4, which is the Portsmouth International Port, the Port Marine Safety Code audit, and we've got Mark here to do the second one. I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
Sorry, Ben McInnes, Deputy Harbour Master.
Hello, Ben.
Yeah, it's
Very
standing
welcome.
in for Rupert.
Right,
And
okay.
Thank you, Leader.
So over to you for item 4.
Yeah, so just a quick update. The updated Port Marine Safety Code, dated 3rd of November 2016, published on the government's website. The main changes relate to the applicability of the code to other organisations, such as marine berths, terminals and jetties, introductory passages in the form of new executive summaries and introductions, and the role of the duty holder, Portsmouth City Council, and the MCA's 3 years compliance exercises. The revised PMSC does now include a short what I need to do section, which summarises 10 recommended measures to help achieve a compliance. As you'll see, the code now only contains 4 sections, as some detail has been moved to the Guide to Good Practice. The Guide to Good Practice, a supplementary addition to the code, was updated 8th of Feb 2017, increasing the scope of the code to non-statutory authorities and supporting the 10 key principles from the Port Marine Safety Code, and then again in 8th of September this year, which is just an updated guide, with no details on which was the updates. We've provided a summary of the Port Marine Safety Code in the notes. I won't go and read all those out to you now. And the Port Director can confirm through the external annual independent audit by Marico Marine and Risk Consultants that Portsmouth International Port continues to comply satisfactorily with the requirements of the Port Marine Safety Code. Audit was carried out by Ray Blair, who is the former Harbour Master of Southampton, on 5th of April 2017, and it was duly noted that the majority of recommendations and observations from the previous report had now been carried out. Overall, the audit concluded that considerable progress had been made and Portsmouth International Port continues to comply satisfactorily with the requirements of the Port Marine Safety Code. Several observations were noted during the review. All were opportunities for improvement rather than non-conformances. They'll be reviewed this January, accepting that any safety recommendations have already been put into place, and will implement further improvements before the next audit in April where considered necessary. Accidents and incidents, again, I've provided a summary for the members, and you can go through those in your own time, and nothing serious. The total number of reported incidents from the 1st of January 17 to 30th of September was 13. Traffic throughput for the port for the 12 months ending 31st of March compared to the 12 months previous, passenger numbers were down, up 0.14%, vehicle numbers up 2.74%, freight down 3.44%, and the number of ships using the port was up 4.29%. And the last 6 months ending 30th of September compared to the previous 6 months of the last year, the passenger numbers were down 1.45%, passenger vehicle numbers were down 2.03%, but freight was up 4.13%, and the number of ships using the port was up 7.42%. And I'll hand over to Mark, who will explain what that means in financial terms. Thank you. Any questions on safety or Port Marine Safety Code?
Thank you very much. At this point in time, no. Mark, I'm not sure that we need a specific finance update on the code, but if you wanted to add anything, I don't think we really need. I wasn't expecting a finance update on this, but...
No, I'll cover the finance in the next report.
Thank you very much. Okay, I mean, this is an important issue. It's obviously something that comes before us annually through the, well, it was called the Port Authority Board, but I think we're now going to call it the Port Marine. There's another name change that's come as part of the National Ports Marine Code that Mike Sellis did go through with some of us at the last Port Authority Board meeting. But actually, the incidents obviously do get reported back to us, and particularly to me as the Cabinet Member quarterly. And for those people that may be watching this online, the reason that we've got the Portsmouth International Port annual Port Marine Safety Code here is because Portsmouth City Council actually owns Portsmouth International Port, and so under the current statutory legislation we have to carry out this check as Ben has stated. Colleagues, any comments on the report?
Thank you, Leader. From what I can tell, most of the incidents are fairly minor. Is there anything that you feel that should be specifically brought to our attention? I mean, reading through, there's nothing that catches my eye that makes me worry, but from your perspective, is there anything that we should be more aware of than other incidents over the past year?
Not particularly with specific incidents to Portsmouth. The trend at the moment is on weighted heaving lines being thrown from ships. What happens is you have what's called a monkey's fist on the end of a line, and it should just be a rope made up of a knot. And unfortunately, some crews put inside metal objects, such as metal balls, weights and shackles, bits and pieces of scrap metal. And we've had some issues with that. So we follow that up with a formal warning procedure to the ships. And they're also reported to the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. And that's a national trend at the moment, and that's just been brought up at the British Tugmasters Association meeting, because they're the key guys who are having lumps of effectively metal thrown at them. But nothing there really, as in there's no trends that we're concerned about.
Councillor Dunn?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you, Leader, and thank you, Ben, for the update.
Councillor Chowdhury, Councillor Galloway? No? Okay. Councillor Galloway?
Yes, I have the fortunate pleasure of working down in the port. Just one thing I'm curious about. When the ships are alongside, they decoke, or whatever the terminology is. Is there a limited time for them to do that?
Are you talking about the discharge of a ship? So, for example, down at MMD, we're unloading ships full of bananas, etc. The time is limited by the draft of the ship in relation to the available depth at the berth. The council spent quite a significant amount dredging the MMD basin, so we can.
But this is about Portsmouth International Port. Just to be very clear, this is about Portsmouth International Port, this report, and we should focus on Portsmouth International Port and not MMD. And do you have a pecuniary interest?
No, I have no pecuniary interest, Chair. It's the decoking of the vessel's engines, the stack basically. And there's a lot of oil residue comes off that. I just want to know if there's a limited period of time that they can do that when they're alongside.
Yeah, and not speaking for MMD at all. From the Port Authority's perspective, we're just concerned about ships not touching the bottom. So we would work those around a time. There's no time limits on when a ship can be in and out. It's all dependent on the ship's draft in relation to the depth of that berth.
Thank you, colleagues. Right, so the purpose of the report is to provide an update on the duty holder for the port under the Port Marine Safety Code and the Port Marine Safety Code audit at Portsmouth International Port, incidents in the harbour and traffic throughout. We are noting the report. It's not for a decision, so that has duly been noted. Thank you very much. Right, on to item 5, which is the MMD Shipping Services Limited and Portsmouth International Port Trading return results and capital outturn report 2016-17. We've got Mark Webb here from the port and MMD, actually. You actually span both roles, so over to you.
Okay, good afternoon. What I'd like to do is spend a couple of minutes just taking you through some of the salient points from this report. So this is a report that looks at the profitability of MMD and the port for the last couple of financial years. Now, for the financial year ending the 31st of March 2017, the combined profit that both entities generated was just shy of 3.4 million. Now, if we look at the detail a little bit, you can see that most of that profit was driven by
the international port, where the ferries and the cruise operators come in and out of. But I'd like to note that MMD did return a profit for the year ending 31st of March 2017. The other thing I'd like to draw to your attention is that for the year ending 15-16, MMD's position included a grant from Portsmouth City Council of 1.5 million. But for the year ending just gone, their position excluded any grant. In other words, MMD's financial position fundamentally improved for the year ending 31st of March 2017. So moving on to the capital programmes, the report shows that MMD invested some in their infrastructure for the year just gone. The more significant investment was at the international port, and the two items of capital expenditure related to the demolition of a floating dock jetty, which enables bigger ships to call at the port, and also the start of a new link span project, which will enable ferries to keep calling at Berth 4 at the continental port. Statistics, Ben's covered some of them off. The report shows that tonnage dues at MMD were higher in 2016/17 than the previous year. International port, most of the dues were up. There was a small downturn in freight, but we are now forecasting for this coming year a pickup in freight again. So finally, looking forwards, the forecast for 2017-18 and beyond, the board is optimistic about MMD's prospects. They are looking to improve the customer experience. They're recruiting a new officer who's due to start in January, new business development officer who's looking to generate business for both the port and MMD, and they're also marketing themselves not just as a fruit business, so we all know that about 70% of the bananas coming into the UK call at MMD. They're also looking to broaden the horizons into general cargo. And onto the port, we are forecasting for 2017-18 a higher profit than in the year ending 16-17. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Yeah, there's some really good news actually about diversification, and particularly when we're talking about bringing goods in. Of course, MMD, the goods come in from around the world and not necessarily from within the European Union anyway. But one of the new contracts that we have just started is bringing blades in from a company called MHI Vestas on the Isle of Wight, who make blades for wind, well, they make entire wind turbines, but they're bringing the blades into Portsmouth. They transfer them from a ship onto a barge and they sell them round to Fawley. And in Fawley they then paint them, but they don't have room at their site on the Isle of Wight to actually paint them, and so they're using MMD as almost a landing point to be able to, yes, I know, Councillor Galloway. I've been to the site actually over on the Isle of Wight. They didn't get planning permission to extend their sheds there, which is the reason why they need to paint them over here. But, you know, yeah, it's great to be able to diversify in that way. I had another meeting this morning about potentially another way that we could be using MMD to help another business sector, which is nothing to do with fruit or vegetables. And at the moment, from what I'm told, the MMD runs at about 60% capacity in terms of its port side. So we have, whilst the hangars are full up with fruit, things that are coming in which don't need to be refrigerated, we have got key space, time, to be able to make it much more commercial. And as Mark has quite rightly said, someone is coming in, starting the business in January to really drive through the commercial business development, which is really, really good news. So I'll start with Councillor Dowling and move down the line as previously.
Thank you, Leader, and thank you for the report. As you say, it's positive to see the profit coming in and subsidising the council's coffers as always. The very small thing, and it's very clearly just a typo and not like getting it wrong. 3.7. I think the first 15-16 is meant to be 16-17, just for accuracy's sake, because I assume you can't compare a year to the same year.
Second 15-16, yes, should be 16-17. Yes.
Yeah.
Can you see that, Mark?
I can. Apologies about that oversight.
No, it's fine. It's pedantic, but for the sake of public record, we might as well just
I agree with you.
correct
It's
it.
entirely. This is a record forever, in perpetuity. Councillor Galloway.
No, that's fine. Nothing really else to add.
Councillor Chowdhury?
Yeah, happy to see this good report, and also it is good news, increasing the profit, that's all.
Thank you very much. I mean, there are, you know, when you're working in any kind of commercial venture, there are always winners and losers. And whilst we have recently had confirmation of having lost one contract will be ending in 2018, we are just on the brink of securing a new one that we think will not just replace that, but will replace plus some. So actually, you know, I think the business is doing well. I'm impressed with the management team that's down there and the support from PCC staff that have now moved permanently over to either the port and MMD. And I hope that the future is very bright for MMD, its staff, and also for Portsmouth International Port. Good. Right, thank you everyone for coming today. That is the end of the Planning, Regeneration and Economic Development decision meeting. It is 2:25. Thank you.